Well, Ukraine says it has retaken the village of Uro-zhaine in the Donetsk region. It is part of Ukraine's counteroffensive to reclaim territory occupied by Russia. But since the offensive started 2 months ago, Kyiv has made slow progress.
A shell is loaded into an American howitzer cannon. This is the front line of Ukraine's counteroffensive. Since June, the army has been pushing back from active positions that extend more than 1,200 kilometers. And despite the supply of weapons from the West, they're only making limited progress, with limited air power and its forces stretched thin. But even small advances could turn out to be tactically significant. This week, Ukrainian troops on the southeastern front claim to have retaken the small village of Uro-zhaine, located within 150 kilometers of the ports of Russia-occupied Mariupol and Berdyansk. And if Ukraine were to take those cities, the land bridge that connects Crimea to Russia through occupied Ukraine would be broken. But getting through heavily fortified Russian lines won't be easy. They'll need to cross open fields, which are extensively mined, where they also run the risk of attacks from the air and Russian troops behind the tree line. And if they make it that far, next they'll face an elaborate maze of trenches and metal and concrete anti-tank defences known as Dragon's Teeth. Still, small advances by either side will reduce the capabilities of the other. Russia recently intensified its operation in the northeast, drawing Ukrainian forces away from more strategic areas in the southeast. Now, Ukraine is making gains on that front, forcing Moscow's military to redeploy. But the to and fro cannot continue in its current form for long, as autumn and mud season fast approaches, when all tanks will be stopped in their tracks until spring.
For more, let's bring in Mike Martin, a War Studies Senior Fellow at King's College London and a former British Army officer. Hi, Mike. Good to see you again. Ukraine here saying it has retaken the village of Uro-zhaine in the Donetsk region. In your view, how much progress are they making here?
So I think we have to look at this in the round. At the moment, Ukraine is advancing in 4 separate areas of the country, and it's doing that quite deliberately, because what that forces Russia to do is spread its forces out very thin. And at the moment, it appears that progress is slow. But over the last month or so, I can give you some statistics that will give your readers some warmth about the progress that they're making. Firstly, the rate of Russian artillery destruction by Ukraine forces is twice what it was, and that's a key part of the way the Russians fight their war. And secondly, the Russians have started to have to move their troops between different bits of the front line, which tells us that the Russians have run out of their reserve. So things are actually progressing quite well, although it's not immediately apparent from the amount of territory that's been taken so far.
Yeah, those numbers sound good, but is this, in the bigger picture, going to be anywhere near enough to regain the territory that Russia seized in the south and east last year?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And of course, we have maybe 3 months until winter and mud sets in. It becomes much more difficult. What Ukraine is trying to do over the summer is it's trying to, as you said in your package, is break that land bridge. And to do that, you only need to get through the lines in one place effectively, and then you can pour your resources in. And Ukraine, of course, still has several brigades in reserve, so it hasn't committed all of its troops, unlike Russia. So I think what we're going to see is, hopefully, at some point over the next 2 months, suddenly somewhere that Russian line will collapse, and then Ukraine will be able to get its resources in. But I agree with you. It is very touch and go, and they have to do it within the next 3 months.
Yeah, so how likely do you think it is that Ukraine will be able to break that land bridge?
That's very, very difficult to say. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't say that. But I think we should look at what happened last year. If we look at last summer, all through last summer, we had a very similar situation to this, where it appeared that no progress was being made, but actually Ukraine was destroying Russian logistics all through the summer. And then in September, we had suddenly a collapse in the Russian lines in Kharkiv and a massive advance. And then in December, just before the beginning of winter, there was another withdrawal by Russian forces in Kherson. And that, to me, seems to be the pattern that we're going to have this summer. So a long summer of what appears to be not much progress, but actually Ukraine is getting on with the job, destroying Russian logistics, destroying their artillery, and then suddenly that line collapses, and then it's very easy to get through those and close that land bridge. It's a very short distance, maybe only 100, 120 kilometres at its thinnest. So that is not a huge distance for a mechanised force.
So in addition to the time pressure there before mud season sets in, what do you think the biggest challenges are that Ukraine is facing at this in this phase of the counteroffensive?
I think there are two. I think the minefields that Russia has laid, and it's incredibly cheap to lay a minefield, of course, and you can do it from an aircraft, are much, much more extensive than the Ukrainians understood them to be. And they have piloted some new innovations using drones to sense the mines at night because they pick up on infrared. So Ukraine is attempting to deal with that. And then the other challenge that they have is that Russia has a slightly more developed, not completely, but slightly more developed ability to use its air force than Ukraine does. And that, again, as you said in your package, if you're crossing open fields with less air support than your enemy has, that can prove very difficult. The combination of the two, minefields and aircraft, is quite a formidable defensive combination.
Well, thank you very much for joining us with that analysis. That is Mike Martin at King's College London.
Thank you very much.
We're joined now by our correspondent, Matthias Bulenga in Kyiv. Matthias, good to see you again. We heard in that report concern over mud season approaching once again. If there is no major breakthrough in the counteroffensive by this autumn, what will that mean for Ukraine?
Well, the question is what will happen until that mud season starts, because it's still some time ahead. And these gains that Ukraine is making now, they of course reflect on the future development of the situation. So it's still possible that things will change. But when that point arrives where it will be difficult to advance with tanks, then of course both sides will have to fortify in the positions that they are, and will have to prepare for the next possible offensive. Ukraine most likely next spring. There's also a winter season where offensives are possible, but last winter Ukraine has not made use of them, partly because the technology, the Western technology, was not there. But things will pretty much slow down, and preparations will be made for the next move.
Yeah, tell us more about Western weapons arriving in Ukraine. What impact have they been having on the battlefields?
The idea that Ukraine had when they started this counteroffensive was that these Western tanks would allow them to break through quickly and straight onto these Russian positions. That has proven wrong. They have lost in the first week or so, or 2 weeks of the counteroffensive, they have lost some equipment, and they found out that due to the heavy mining, they would not be able to have this very bold advance that they were hoping for. This is why they have changed their tactics. However, these Western weapons, we're talking about tanks, but we're also talking about, and that's very important at this stage, artillery and other drones, etc., that are able to strike behind the lines, because what the tactic is now is that they are going to weaken the Russian supply lines. They're trying to weaken the Russian supply lines and the Russian artillery positions. They're trying to hit at the Russian artillery positions as much as possible in order to complicate Russia's supply and Russia's positions, to make it more difficult for Russia to hold these positions there rather than confronting them head on. So these systems now make a big difference. Ukraine says, including the cluster munition, that they are saying, we haven't, been able to verify this, that it's much more effective in hitting the Russian trenches with these cluster munitions that the US have provided.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, as always. That is DW's correspondent, Matthias Bulenga in Kyiv.